Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I am live about now. Welcome to a new, somewhat more controversial episode with MarkTech. Briefly, before we start, I just wanted to say thank you. I know I've been doing so in every video ever since for the last 2 weeks, but one of my videos just hit over 7,000 views. We hit over 5,000 subscribers on this channel. Now, I know that most people are joining without even necessarily a full understanding that this is a live stream channel. Like, we added like the last 1,000 people basically on the strength of one regular video. So I really hope anybody who tunes in, who is interested, will also subscribe, like, hit the notification bell so they're actually informed whenever I'm about to go live next, so that we can keep growing as a community that isn't only subscribed. Of course, I greatly appreciate that, but of course also as a community where we can directly interact with each other in live streams on Twitter. You can follow me there. And all stuff like that. I love having your feedback. I love having your questions. I love having your suggestions. And this is just me further encouraging you to further encourage me, basically. Now, let me start with a little public service announcement, which is that if you are like a developer, a tester, or you're just somebody who can now install a developer beta, which is now easier than ever, you can now install iOS 17.1 and iPadOS 17.1. You can now install macOS Sonoma 14.1, and you can install, of course, those are already like the second beta here. I think this is the first beta, right? Let me just briefly click on it. No, it's also the second beta, right? I somehow missed, I guess, the first beta of macOS Sonoma 14.1. And you can also install various other betas, most importantly, probably out of the rest, being watchOS 10.1 beta 2. I don't yet know if it enables the double tap gesture that we have discussed in previous videos and in basically all my content covering the Apple Watch Series 9 and Apple Watch Ultra 2, but I'll let you know once I know, and maybe even once I tested it out. But our main story of today is, as I said, somewhat controversial. It's not something that I really enjoy talking a lot. I don't know how long of a discussion this will become. Again, I'm trying very different times for streaming. Maybe at this time it's worse for the algorithm for me to always stream at different time points than to just get one time point where I know people will join, even if it's very few people. But I'm trying it out. I know I have audiences now in the United States, in India, where it's now my biggest market, and I really try to have something for everyone to a degree, which I know over time will obviously not work out. But while I'm still on my holidays, while I'm still enjoying my extra time, I also wanted to give back to the community through offering new times, new opportunities to interact directly. So, and before we fully start, cheers. As always, please let me know if the audio is alright, if the video quality is good. I have, as always, my iPad where I check my stream quality next to me, but I'm still somewhat paranoid. So forgive me for not being as informed about this as I usually am when I go into something right pre-watch. But today was a very busy day. I basically saw this issue come up, and I read a little bit of it, but I don't yet know the details, so I would like to go through as much detail as I can. I cannot access Reuters for free, I think. So I think it makes sense to, or can I? Yeah, well, there's also like the ad block stuff. Continue. Jesus, yeah, I'll keep it on Mac Rumors for now. I think they'll have an educated analysis on the article. And again, if somebody wants to contribute their own opinion or have specific questions, the live chat is open to you. So, Apple has started requiring new apps to show proof of a Chinese government license in order to be listed on the Chinese App Store, as the company joins rival app stores that adopted the policy years earlier to meet tightening state regulations. So this is, I knew about this law for a while. I think I kind of almost forgot about it because nobody really kept mentioning it. China basically requires a ton of licensing for doing business in China. Now that licensing can look very different between different industries, right? Sometimes they require you partner up with a Chinese company. Sometimes they require you to be very productive in China. Let's say Apple, right? It's not like Apple has to sell their iPhones branded as a Xiaomi phone, but it's obviously Apple's power in China and the amount of people they employ and the amount of money they create for the country that allows them that kind of independence. Not every business, even major like international car companies like VW, don't really easily get away with putting out their own product onto the Chinese market. They have to partner with somebody else. They have to make long-term commitments to the Chinese economy, things like building factories there, getting minerals and raw materials from China. So there is a lot. China is definitely very protective of its own economy in that regard. And there are pros and cons to that. It's definitely not a free market as a lot in the laissez-faire capitalist West would associate with it. I'm against those kinds of restrictions. On a broad basis, I can understand when they sometimes make sense, right? If you're a very poor country and you need some kind of growth to come from external sources, that's one thing. But in China's case, a lot of it is happening not really just for the protection of the economy, but for the direct protection of the interest of the Chinese Communist Party and their power in China. So it's a very, very controversial issue, but it's by far not just an issue limited to smartphone app stores. Don't be fooled for a second. While this is a specific law specifically for like smartphone and even desktop app stores, Steam, for example, has to even comply with something like that. When we are talking about just Chinese regulations, Chinese restrictions, Apple is by no means in a unique position in China. If anything, Apple is in a unique position in China with how much they can get away, right? It's like when people say, well, others started years earlier, basically, that shows Apple's power, and it shows that like there has been probably more pressure put onto them by the CCP. This is a little bit, right, the difference when you talk about a dictatorship, right? Because there's no question about it. China is a one-party dictatorship, like it or not. You can argue that their previous systems were already not great, so maybe the CCP is better than the previous emperors or something like that. I think that's a bogus discussion to be had, given that China has had decades and decades of already economic reform, deeper ties to the West. It's by all means time for them to start improving. But given that it's been kind of going in a different direction, it's hitting more and more companies, and people in the West, where a lot of those companies come from, will be having discussions on when is it time to potentially bail on the Chinese market, because those restrictions don't line up with our beliefs in the freedom of speech, democracy in general, workers' rights, and more. Again, I'm open to questions, I'm open to criticisms, I'm open to suggestions. So if you want to engage with me, I'm open for you. Apple last Friday began requiring an Internet Content Provider ICP filing from developers when they submit new apps to be published on the local app store. So to be fully understanding of what it means, right? nothing fundamentally changes obviously for Apple themselves. We have talked about policies that could result in the change of how Apple as a hardware majority company operates, right? We have talked about potential sales bans for the workers of the CCP when it comes to getting iPhones, so they were required to potentially get only Chinese phones. Then the Chinese government basically came out and said it's false. There's been no further reporting on that issue corroborating them. So it seems like this issue has been probably an internal discussion maybe with the CCP or something like that, but it didn't become actual policy, or maybe it was policy in very, very small instances. Maybe it was like an experiment. It does not seem to be official. We will see if Apple sales in China suffer over the next year or so. They just launched a potentially very successful, very popular generation. The iPhone 15 Pro seems to be selling ever so slightly better than the 14 Pro, which is already good. The 14 Pros and the 13 Pros sold really well, and the regular iPhone 15 seems to be doing potentially much better than the base iPhone 14 did. And with that, also potentially better than the iPhone 13 did, because while the iPhone 13 by itself was really popular, the iPhone 13 mini definitely wasn't. So with this case, though, it's not about how Apple sells iPhones or anything like that. It's about the developers that offer third-party apps on Apple's App Store, which is the largest foreign app store that China allows in their country. So Apple has a lot of leverage there, but also a lot to lose with their 15 or 30% commission that they collect from app sales and in-app purchases. And in this case, if you don't have a specific license as basically an internet content provider now from the Chinese government, you will not be able to put your app on an app store like Apple's, and Apple previously was allowing people who did not yet have such a license or were never ever gonna get one, because we are potentially talking about like social media networks that are banned in China anyway. So even the people who downloaded those apps couldn't even really use them without also using a VPN, which is coincidentally why also a lot of VPNs have been getting axed from Chinese services. So this does not change the majority of Apple's business. Given that most money from the App Store comes from games, and it's very likely that most developers will be able to get licenses to sell games on the App Store, given that in China, usually Chinese apps and Chinese services sell best anyway, that means even if a lot of Western companies potentially lose out on such a license, that won't meaningfully impact the size and revenue scope of the Chinese App Store, and with it how much money Apple gets to collect as a commission from the Chinese App Store. So Apple will not suffer here. At most, I think, even in the West, most people will unfortunately not care about this. And what might happen at worst for Apple will be like some kind of hearing in Congress where they're like, oh, you are complying with the communists, even though China isn't communist, by the way. Never let anyone tell you that China is communist. Communism is supposed to be a classless, stateless, and moneyless existence. How many of those things apply to China? Literally none. It's just a one-party dictatorship that is using red flags. It's in no means communist. It's in no means socialist. But that's a different discussion that unfortunately I care a lot about, but most people don't. Let me just briefly check if my stream is doing all right. Yep, great. To get the license, developers must have a company in China or work with a local publisher, and this is what most go for, right? That's what made the likes of Tencent so big. It's not just the fact that they themselves have a lot of money and a lot of publishers they own, but they, by sheer necessity, by basically requirement by law, they become the publisher for a lot of Western companies to operate in China. For example, Blizzard had a public falling out with Tencent, and I don't even know if they found a new publisher, but this is what makes a lot of like Chinese publishers appear way more important than they have actually any right to be. They didn't build most of their success. It was basically required from one day to the other by the government. A requirement that has stymied take up by a large number of foreign apps. Yeah, of course. Well, people want it. Not everybody can get it. It's probably a little easier if you're a game than if you're a social media network. So you can understand that this creates a lot of problems and potentially a lot of controversies whenever people discover the machinations going on here. Most local app stores, including those operated by Tencent and Huawei, have adopted the filing since at least 2017. I think that the issue that we have discussed prior, right? The issue that Apple potentially would be banned from Chinese, workers' phones, people who work either directly for the CCP or for companies that are heavily funded by the CCP. I believe that this was an element of pressure put on by China, from China onto Apple, to show them that this is what could happen to you. Again, there's been no reporting to corroborate that this is actually in place and this is actually impacting sales of iPhones. Instead, what I think it was an element of leverage against two things. First is what I discussed in my previous live stream about China and Apple, which is that this is a little bit of leverage against some sanctions or basically economic restrictions that America has been putting onto China for basically, well, since Trump, but Biden continued a lot of that. The idea there is that since China is known to really not care about intellectual property rights a lot and sometimes blatantly copies technologies that come from companies who are operating in China, often operating through a secondary Chinese company, because that is required by law. In fact, we just saw this. Right, sometimes you work with a local publisher, and sometimes if you are a large-scale manufacturer, you aren't even existing in China under the same name as you do in the West. You instead operate under a secondary company that you either open up in China or that you partner up with an already existing company with. So in this case, right, we have companies like Tencent and Huawei already complying, and China wants this to work for all companies, right? No matter if you are Tencent and Huawei, which are Chinese companies, but also Apple. So what do? Well, they want America to not have as many economic restrictions on them. So they basically blackmail America indirectly by going against one of their strongest international companies, Apple. And the other thing they want is what I just explained, is that they want Apple to comply with the same laws as their local companies. I actually think Steam China license law. I think Steam for a while has been for concerning regards Steam China. Steam is not illegal in China yet. The fragile state of Steam. Games accessible to Steam are not licensed for domestic release. Steam is partnership between Valve and right. So Steam China is basically not a direct product from Valve as we know it. So in fact, it's like cooperating with like a Chinese company, and this Chinese company is basically also making all developers that go through Steam China. It's very, very important. We have Steam China. It's not like we have Steam Germany here. We have Steam, and sure, from time to time there will be like local legislation regarding like age restrictions or maybe some content moderation policies that don't apply in every region universally, and that will result maybe some games will like censored in some regions, maybe some games will not come onto that market at all, but it's still a very different proposition from an app store, so to speak, that requires you to operate almost locally to a specific country, so that that country can vet and like moderate your content even further. Now again, it's very different when we are talking about like your next Candy Crush release, and obviously something like Instagram or Facebook, right? There's a lot of different implications here. So Apple is simply falling in line with a recently updated policy that is already established in China's software publishing industry. So again, really only being basically the last one to fall. It's not like Apple is like ass kissing the CCP in a way that nobody else does. It's pretty in fact remarkable how long they have held out. Again, I'm not like praising Apple for what they did now, but I have to acknowledge nuance here. It's not like you cannot hear from what I'm saying that I'm like I'm not critical of China, or like I do want companies to comply with laws like this. It's just when you have like, it's not like Apple just is the business of selling iPhones in China. China for Apple is literally their lifeblood in so many ways, because that's where most of their products are currently assembled. This is where they get a lot of materials for things such as batteries and raw earths. It's remarkable how dependent they would be on China, even if they weren't necessarily constructing in China. A lot of outsourcing that is now happening from China to countries like Vietnam or India, it is often happening under Chinese companies, not just because Apple is forced to do that. They are by no means really are forced to work with Foxconn in a country other than China. It just so happens that due to now decades of expertise in constructing electronics, it's really hard to find companies that are as good as the likes of Foxconn or even Pegatron when it comes to operating tech factories. So we might really dislike Apple's dependence on China. We might dislike a lot of the West's dependence in general on China, but it's much more difficult to get rid of it than some people suspect. There's a really easy explanation that some people sometimes bring up, right? But it's patently false. Chinese wages versus Asia, I think. Do we have... Please give me a graph. I work well with graphs. Nope, they don't have a graph. What the... Who makes a numbers article without a graph? Look, in China, people make more money than in Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, or India, right? This is, by the way, why a lot of outsourcing is going specifically to these two countries. They're also very populous. I think Vietnam is like at 150 million people or something like that. India is at 1.5 billion, having overtaken China. So there won't be any problems with finding workers there. And those workers are significantly cheaper than Chinese workers. The problem is why a lot of companies still want to stay in China. It has a lot to do with those workers are now much better trained yet than workers here or here. There are already factories built here, which basically reduces average cost, maybe from here down to here. While here you have to first build those factories. India probably by now could have much higher wages if they haven't had for years like pretty restrictive policies on how companies can operate inside India, right? That primarily refers to you have to pay like huge import taxes and stuff like that. So India by itself was not a very attractive market right away, and it wasn't a very rich market. So people really wanted to not have much to do with India. It's basically like a chicken and an egg situation. India has a ton of people. India, even with a small percentage of rich people, because there are so many people there, will have still plenty of rich people for you to serve. And India, while they do have some regulations, some requirements, they're still not really comparable to a lot of Western bureaucracies, certainly not to Germany, where it can take years and years to just lay the foundation for a new factory. But what is happening now with India is companies understood they now want to serve India better, and the best way to do so is to start building in India, because then they can get rid of the expensive import tax, and they can create deeper relationship with the Indian government, which will then probably result in even lower regulations down the road. And it will result in a little bit of extra goodwill from the Indian people, so they might be more likely to buy a product where it says assembled in India. But it's usually not as big of a thing as some people make it out to be, like the pride of local manufacturing or something like that. But it still helps, especially if you're a developing country where you really are looking forward to your quality of life going up. Showing some appreciation to companies that really take the leap and invest more is not the least realistic thing to happen, right? Just making sure again everything works. I sometimes get a little worried midstream. So when people are trying to say, Apple operates in China because China has like the cheapest labor, that's absolutely not true. Like, even in the West, the difference would not actually be that high, because while yes, Chinese labor would be cheaper than Western labor, it's very likely that a lot of companies that would now be built from the ground up in the West would be far more modernized and far more automated, so they would need far fewer workers, which results in the overall pay they have to give to workers to go down, and to basically almost equalize to what they are paying in China overall. But yeah, if you ever find somebody who tells you, well, they are in China because China is dirt cheap, it's basically slave labor. Well, slave labor is a different issue as well, but no, regular people do. It's still little to comparison to what a lot of people make in most Western countries. But when you look at the other Asian countries where companies could be operating, well, China is by no means the cheapest anymore. Let's continue with the main article. China already blocks websites of many popular Western social media apps like Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, but iPhone users in China have been able to download their apps from Apple's App Store by using unauthorized VPN services that connect them to an internet server outside the countries. Under new rules issued in July by China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, Apple will no longer be able to offer such apps in its China App Store from next July unless the app operators are registered with the government. Yeah, believe me, guys, Insta and Facebook are never coming to China. If YouTube ever comes to China, it will be like, you know how the YouTube Kids app is like heavily like basically like curated. That's the only way in which we could ever get YouTube, and even then I think likely stuff like YouTube Shorts and live streams would probably be prohibited, because those are harder to moderate in terms of content. Yeah, Insta, no way, Jose. Nothing Facebook related. By the way, a lot of people were like, well, isn't it like good that those companies are not in China? Those companies would love to be in China. It's not their love for free speech that is holding them back. I know it's been part of Google where they said, we are not gonna like rewrite the Google search engine to fit Chinese like CCP ideology. That's admirable. That's correct, basically. However, when we come to overall services like that are very broad in their reach, with YouTube, it's not like, it's just that YouTube is so large that Google sees no way to enter China without making YouTube basically a shadow of what it ever could be here in the West, or in the rest of the world for that matter. But if they could conceivably create a YouTube China that is from the ground up 100% compliant with Chinese laws and would never give them problems with what they have to block or ban, because that is the other issues, right? You can launch a service that is completely compliant with laws, but what happens once people start posting onto your platform stuff that isn't compliant with Chinese laws or even with Chinese vibes? That becomes a very, very different topic, unfortunately. Under new rules issued in China, Apple will no longer be able to offer such apps, basically all apps that don't have that kind of license, from next July, unless the app's operators are registered with the government. Chinese officials last week reportedly told Apple staff that the company must strictly implement the rules banning unregistered foreign apps, thereby closing the loophole allowing Chinese iPhone users to download them. Apple was said to have been told that the new rules are needed to crack down on online scams. Sure, China, a country where online scams famously never happen. Pornography, well, yeah, but again, I am a free speech almost absolutist, so you can guess my stance on pornography. And the circulation of information that violates China's censorship rules. Okay, I like the way they put this, because it's like, yeah, guys, porn might not be information, but it's the same thing, right? It's just, it doesn't adhere to China's censorship rules. The same, like online scams is always what people bring up when they, like, look, I have defended, for example, the existence of the App Store as a monopoly on iOS app distribution, partially because of online scams. Well, guess what? Even in a somewhat poorly regulated app store, it still will be better than the overall World Wide Web. I absolutely stand by that. But when an entire country tells you that anything that operates without our license is way more likely to be an online scam, even though we deliberately go out of our way to exclude everything that we simply don't like, yeah, then you know this is just pretense. I don't know if this was like reporting based on how China, how they got information, right? If that is the correct order, right? Online scams, pornography, and stuff we don't like. But I would be really interested. And saying it happened last week, I think lends a little bit of credence to basically the China ban on Apple devices that happened like, what, a month ago at this point, or didn't happen, to be more precise. I think this was almost like the first hammer to drop. Or shoe to drop, right? That's, I think, is the correct way to say it. I think this was like basically putting pressure on Apple to make them accept things like this. Apple concerned about China's new App Store rules banning unregistered foreign apps. China already blocks website. Again, all Facebook stuff, right? Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, X, formerly known as Twitter, still Twitter. Basically, social media, by the way, is almost blocked by default. This is also part of a problem for Google in general, because Google is not just known for their search engine, which again is also obviously a problem for China, but Google is also known for their connection to YouTube. So whenever Google just wants to play the good guy, that, oh, we are voluntarily not in China, believe me, they would like to be. But iPhone users in China can still download the apps, right? So people still want to use those things. They've been downloaded 170 million. Like, especially think of how important YouTube is for the West. Like, do you really think Chinese people would not want to access it? However, the operators are unlikely to register with the Chinese government. Yes, according to the report, Apple was told during the recent discussions that the new rules are needed to crack down on the things we've already discussed. China has recently banned government officials from using iPhones and other foreign smartphone workers for work or from bringing such devices to their government offices. And earlier this month, this ban was expanded to multiple state agencies and state companies. Again, I cannot tell you if this is actually correct. This is Mac Rumors has put this on as a report when? It's September 29th. Wait, what? So it's not been that long ago? But like, I have not seen actual proof. Again, I'm not saying this to actually downplay anything. If China had banned iPhones from, as they say, for work or from bringing devices to government offices, well, government offices, by the way, is one thing. A lot of countries have regulations and what you can actually use as like while working for the government. Even something like the iPhone was problematic for a while because there weren't like extra firewalls that you could put up on an iPhone. I don't know if that really changed with like the US president. I think Trump just kept on using his iPhone regardless of what the Secret Service was telling him. But that wouldn't be the real problem. But like this with like, state agencies as well and state companies. Like state companies are not the same as government related offices. A ton of companies in China can be counted to be state companies because they're just owned by their one-party government. Most foreign app operators... Wait, did we go back? I think they just copy pasta some of their things they've said in the last one, right? Most are unlikely to register with the Chinese government. Is that not basically what they said? However, the operators are unlikely to register with the Chinese government since doing so would force them... Because doing so, they just rephrased that. That's cool. Would force them to comply with data transfer and censorship requirements. By the way, it's not that those companies would be like incapable to accept some censorship. It's just that their core service wouldn't be able to run under those censorship requirements. Like China would be blocking so much shit on fucking Facebook and Twitter. Like Twitter nowadays is 1/4 bots, 1/4 porn, 1/4 ultra-nationalist from the US because of what Elon Musk has created on that platform. Like China would be, and then another quarter is basically people wanting to experience Twitter as per usual. There's a reason why average Twitter numbers have gone down. But even for a not shitty service, potentially, it would be incredibly difficult to operate. For Twitter, it would be basically like making 80% of content on Twitter unavailable. But even for the likes of Facebook and just YouTube is so large, you have to understand that there's also like a difference from like deleting for like managing a 120 to 240 sign tweet versus a video that can span 50 seconds or 60 seconds for a short, or it can be 6 hours long if this is some kind of Destiny history breakdown or something like that. This will leave Apple with no choice but to remove them or face legal sanctions. Yeah, Apple will be removing stuff that doesn't comply there. It's also important to say that a lot of companies already don't really operate in China by default, so people will not really lose out on services that already exist officially, but it will make it even harder for them to access stuff that they've previously been able to access with stuff like VPNs. Especially, as I said before, now that VPNs have also been cracked down through the CCP. Yeah, so again, it's a nuanced issue. It's hard for me to say what Apple should actually do. Quite honestly, I think if I were in like Tim Cook's shoes, I probably would agree with this, given that like you've been like holding out for like years at this point. there clearly is no changing of mind on the Chinese side. Relationship with the US are already pretty bad, which sure, China and the US will coexist, and they are very economically interdependent, and most of the West is economically interdependent with China. Hell, a lot of Europe gets most of its products from China. But there can come a point with dictatorships where they will act against their own self-interest. They will act hyper-irrationally if confronted. Again, this is not an excuse, right? It's not like we should bow down to what Putin is doing in Ukraine because, we might provoke him or something like that. But we already do so, right? We don't send like troops from Western Europe or even Eastern Europe, for that matter, outside of the Ukraine. I know the Ukraine is somehow supposed to be a slur in English, so forgive me if I ever use that. In German, it's pretty common way to use the article before the word, and in native Russian, which is my first language, you don't use an article before the word anyway. Like, articles are far less often used throughout. Like, you don't even say like you see a table right in front of you. In Russian, you would say basically, I see table. Right, but that's a different discussion. So I just don't want that to be misunderstood. I am a native Russian speaker. I'm from Moldova, from a country that is like 1/3 or 1/4 occupied by Russia. So believe me, I have no sympathies for Putin or the Russian government. I'm very, very much in strong support of the Ukraine's task to liberate their country. So it's just that sometimes things that the West deems controversial in regards to like Eastern Europe is like stuff that most Eastern Europeans never even think about for the most part. It's mostly stuff that somehow gets contorted by like Western intellectuals, which I guess I am partially to a degree with like being a med student in the West. But yeah, that was a long tangent to just say I don't support dictatorships. I think even highly flawed democracies will be better than the best dictatorships, because in a democracy you can always work on improving it. Something you can with dictatorships, you just have to hope that whatever comes next, your next benevolent leader will be a little more humane towards you than the previous one. Right. So, but what I wanted to say about myself, right? What would I do in this specific scenario if I were in Tim Cook's shoes? Well, if this was just happening, right? I guess my modus operandi would be to hold off for as long as I can to see whether like my government, like the US government in this case, will be able to put some pressure on China to stop such a law from happening. Maybe if I can find some workarounds. Maybe if I can just get some time so that people learn to work around that, like they did with stuff like VPNs, right? But this is not the first day of it happening. It's been years and years in the making. And it's been accepted by basically every other company that operates in China. So to be quite honest, if I were in Tim's shoes, I probably at this point would also give in. Like, I don't know if like that ban on Chinese on iPhones in China for like government workers, companies, state-owned companies and stuff like that is fully true. But I fully believe, by the way, that this is that it's been at least discussed, that it's been a somewhat relevant point for Apple to consider when it comes to operating in China. So if you're a Tim Cook and you're not just thinking of a country with 1.4 billion people where you can sell your iPhone, but also the country where most of your devices are assembled. And if Apple was like cut off like one day to the next from China, it would create, well, I do believe, by the way, it would hurt China a whole lot more than the collective West, right? I think we could readjust in the long term. It would do an enormous damage in the short term, but I think we can bring back back a lot of those companies, and those companies would then be forced to pay Western wages and stuff like that. But when it comes to Apple, that damage would be tremendous, and it would not be easy to replicate what they have done in China in almost any other country. Even right now, as they operate in India or Vietnam with the help of Chinese companies, I would imagine those bans would not just obviously prevent Apple from building in China, but also from working with other Chinese companies. So I can understand the pressure, and I probably, if I were beholden to a ton of shareholders and I was responsible for thousands of workers, which again, I'm not claiming that this is ever Tim's highest priority, but I still don't think that this is completely a nothing issue to even to like CEOs like him. So to me, yeah, I probably would give in after almost 6 years of somewhat holding out, after every company around you has given into this, and considering that most companies, most developers that you would be defending with them have already not been operating in China for the vast majority of time. And by the way, like, you might get those things blocked on the App Store fully and maybe accessible with a VPN, but guess what? If the VPN works, it would also probably work just through Safari. But it's also likely that the VPN probably won't work, given how China has been cracking down on those. So it's not like Apple at this point would need to keep those apps, have to hope that VPNs still stay largely available, and then risk having incredible sanctions potentially put onto them by China. It's not like, because China, the reason why I wanted to stress that they are a dictatorship is not because China, not because it's just a moral quandary for Apple, right? How do they operate in a dictatorship? A ton of companies operate pretty well in dictatorships, believe me. But the point here is, a dictatorship is also much more likely to be hyper aggressive towards anybody who doesn't listen to their laws. It's one thing to comply with, to maybe avoid some taxes, right, in a democracy. Then you get penalized for it. You have to pay taxes back. Hell, maybe they can even put some of your leaders in jail. It doesn't happen nearly often enough, unfortunately, given how many corrupt people we have in large businesses. But hey, it can happen. But I want to say no real country, but really no country in the West, I should put it more like that, or even throughout most free market countries, will ever like dissolve a company or prohibit it entirely from operating on their soil for like small problems, right? They will put like, even in Europe, by the way, right? You can like, a lot of those regulations that have been put onto companies, they can result in the company not being able to operate in Europe, but many of them are said to come with severe money punishments. Now, those monetary punishments are severe, and they would gut a company in the long term to the point where they absolutely would not be able to keep existing. But there is still some workaround. But with a dictatorship, it's very, very likely that you would get, if you really anger them, that you get like the most severe punishment possible. In the case of a foreign company operating in another country, it would be a complete ban of operating in your company, selling your products, and even creating your products there if you already have factories there, workers there, things like that. So while I don't believe that China would necessarily go as far right away, we already have seen stuff like them trying to put pressure on Apple in other ways, like potentially saying, well, we wouldn't ban iPhones completely, but we would ban them for government workers, and then we will ban them for state-owned companies, and then potentially we will put them that on your social credit score in a negative way if you decide to buy an iPhone which comes from a foreign company which does not comply with all of our laws. And this would basically kill Apple's business in China as well. Because believe me, people do want a relatively positive social credit score there. So yeah, it's a nuanced topic, and I don't actually like. There are moral issues sometimes when it comes to operating in China, and I've covered some of them. I've talked about like the Uyghur Muslims and what it means for potentially involving slave labor, basically in the like some people have said that there are slave laborers in like iPhone factories. I have never seen truth to that. What I have seen instead is that people are forced to work in like mineral extraction sites and stuff like that, right? Mining sites, and that those minerals, those raw earth materials, then go into obviously Chinese supply chains. And sometimes companies will try to look if those companies where they get their materials from and what the work conditions they are. But it's sometimes companies don't really want to know, but sometimes it's actually really hard to find out, because even like the Uyghur Muslims, right, it's a small part of the Chinese population. They obviously won't operate in every factory and at every mining site, and they sometimes will not even be like really easily to say, oh right, that's an Uyghur Muslim there, right, who is forced. And even if you come to them as a Western interviewer, there might be a chance that they just say, no, I'm Han Chinese, whatever. I'm fully here for no other reasons than my love of the CCP and my desire to work in the glorious Chinese People's Republic to contribute to the great communist revolution started under Mao and then perfected under Deng economic principles. Right? I know that might sound absurd, but in dictatorships like this, it's not, I mean, it's obviously not as bad as like North Korea, or to a degree like countries like Turkmenistan, right? You don't have to pretend to be communist to be a dictatorship. But yeah, this is a political issue to a large degree, and I do like engaging with politics, and I also like to be honest with you guys. Would I prefer iPhones to be manufactured like for the North American market, like maybe somewhere in the US or somewhere in Mexico? I doubt they would really try to put a ton of companies into Canada, even though that still would be dope. I would like for there to be a company in Europe that operates for most of Europe, or maybe 2 factories in Europe, right? And then for Asia and Southeast Asia, you could then argue, well, do you need 1 factory in China and 1 factory in India and 1 factory in Vietnam or something like that? Hell, maybe you even want to operate in Japan, where you have easy, close supply chains with stuff like Sony lenses and things like that, right? I would obviously prefer that in the long run, but this isn't the world we currently live in. And Apple has already put some effort into divesting from China to a degree, right? Apple, how do I even put it? Moving away from China, I guess. That just sounds like a kid moving away to college. It's like Apple has been shifting its supply chain out China, but it still needs Chinese contractors to build the Vision Pro. Well, it's not like it's just the Vision Pro. Is it an article about the Vision Pro in general, or is it 3 major companies trying to move supply chains out of China and how they are faring in their attempts to move away from the factory of the world? China has been the world's factory for over 40 years, which, by the way, the fact that it's been the world's factory for 40 years kind of shows that it's not completely indispensable. If we made it for the most part into the world's factory, not even since just the second half of the 20th century, but really towards the end of the 20th century, then we can really turn the ship around. China's era of globalization and integrated supply chain started to crumble around 2018, after then-President Donald Trump launched a trade war against the East Asian giant. Nearly 3 years of strict on-off COVID lockdowns. Yeah, by the way, I don't know if Business Insider is like somewhat right-leaning. Like, Trump's sanctions against China didn't do shit in the long run, right? Like, he imposed like tariffs on certain products, it really didn't like he put some tariffs on foreign steel in general, which I think also impacted like Canadian steel, which is where America actually got a lot of their steel, right? Just put it like Trump tariff Canadian steel. Yeah, so Trump tariffs, including raw Canadian aluminum. Okay, so it was aluminum, not steel, I guess. Yeah. So, so I guess it was Chinese steel and Canadian aluminum, right? So it's not like he just moved against China. So this was always stupid. This is like a country that they operate under like real agreements under, and he somehow went against it. This was not how the world ever wanted the US to go against China. They wanted a far more organized approach, a far more West cohesive approach, or even like involving countries like India. Why not? Right? India is the world's largest democracy. Sure, a flawed one, but many democracies are flawed. And as I've said, I prefer even the most flawed democracy over a dictatorship. So to me, this is just interesting that people want to like give Trump some credit here. Nobody took this seriously. Like, this was really in the process of hurting the US more than any of those other countries. The real thing that hurt China were the on-off COVID-19 lockdowns, which meant that companies were not really able to operate there in a cohesive way. It scared off a lot of investors, but it also showed that China's like policies, where they can really be like super draconian or super lax to the degree where they pretend that certain problems don't exist. Again, really dictatorial trait. It happens to the best of us sometimes, but with dictatorships, it's almost universal. Like the Soviet Union told people that the radiation wave from Chernobyl would basically spare our socialist sister republics. Yeah, guess what? It didn't. But this was taught and like replicated literally in news shows and stuff like that. So they've been moving away from China. Again, they're bringing up Vision Pro. I don't think it's such a big issue, right? But they've built like in India, they've built in Vietnam. They're trying to do more stuff. I'm not like reacting to any YouTube video right now, but so even like the Wall Street Journal in 2022. So you can see, by the way, just from when those articles came out, we've had like discussions about this in like 2018, 2017, when China was doing a lot of bad shit. But this really is like a post-COVID development. It might have happened earlier than 2022, because obviously COVID happened prior than just 2022. Especially December 2022. But once Apple saw like the inconsistencies that China was creating and the bad atmosphere around issues like COVID, this is when they started being more aggressive into investing into other production sites. But alas, they are not there yet, and they might over time leverage like the lower wages in Vietnam and India to also like prevent some inflationary pressure that is going against some of devices in general. Like maybe this will help like stymie some of the world's inflation, right? Even if those countries go up to Chinese levels of wages, that would then normalize prices to where they currently are, right? In like this is up to 2020. Let's say they reach the same wages that China had in 2020, but they reach those in 2030 or something like that. Well, that's 6 years of extra stuff, of extra time to fight inflation, and it's a lot of economic growth for those companies potentially, including the communist Vietnam. But I guess I should maybe open like a political streaming channel or something like that. So yeah, So I can see the problems for Apple. I see the problems for basically everyone with a topic like this. Again, I have said time and time again that I do not hide my opinions on this channel. I have been grateful for anybody who joined my channel throughout the world. I will not, obviously not Chinese, so it's not like I attacked them. And I have been somewhat nice to India, but not because a lot of my viewers come from there, but because I genuinely believe that even with all the problems that India might have, it's still a way better production site for device creation than China. So it's a nuanced topic. I've said what I believe, which is I wish this wasn't happening, which I gave Apple some credit for holding out since 2017 to a degree. I outlined problems that happened somewhat recently that could have made them go this route finally. I've also talked about how in the long term they can have more leverage over China, right? If they actually start producing in other countries, they can tell China, well, we built almost like a city around our factory here. If you don't want to lose that as well, right? We've already been investing less into you. Well, if you don't want to lose that as well, be a little bit more lenient. Now, it can also backfire. I'll be absolutely honest. If Apple doesn't keep investing more into China, China will become potentially more bold in restricting Apple with the argument of like, you aren't such a big part of our economy anymore. We can afford to lose you or something like that. So again, hyper nuanced topic. I try to outline as much of it as I can. I do hope that anybody who is interested will reach out and we can have an interesting discussion about it. It's complicated, but I don't think it's anything we have to hide from. Regardless, I do hope that we can keep going to topics that are overall more interesting, like let's just for the fun of it, right? Apple preparing 17.03, likely with bug fixes for iPhone 15 Pro. So apparently that's now internally debated. Double Tap is now actually in watchOS 10.1, so I'll definitely be installing it soon after and then discussing that with you. So it's not like we just have negative topics to talk about. In fact, often when we talk about negative topics, for example, when we talked about the original Apple ban in China, we then were able to read up on it and see that, well, it probably isn't happening quite the way it was outlined. When we're talking about overheating, we then got confirmation from Apple that they're working on a fix. When we were talking about potential cracking issues, I've done a stream yesterday where I've talked about Consumer Reports findings, where they found that the iPhone 15 Pro is still very, very durable. So tomorrow I will be reacting to the Google Pixel 8 introduction. I'll be doing that live, hopefully. So I hope you'll join me for that. And I hope we can all calm down after a somewhat controversial discussion. I wish you all still a good day, night, evening, morning, whatever time it is at your place. Thank you again so much for supporting this channel. This means so much to me. See you guys next time. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.